Your NZ Super can legally follow you overseas, but only if you play by the rules. If you get this wrong, you could lose your entire payment, or worse, end up owing work and income money back. Thousands of Kiwi retirees assume their NZ Super just travels with them wherever they go. It doesn't. And the gap between what people think happens and what actually happens is where retirees lose real money. There's one rule buried in the fine print that catches almost everyone off guard. A rule about a specific country most people assume is completely safe. I'll get to that shortly, and it might change your retirement plans if you're heading there. This applies to anyone currently receiving NZ Super, anyone approaching 65, and anyone thinking about spending part of their retirement overseas, and the numbers involved are bigger than most people realize. I'm David, and you're watching New Zealand Pension Plan, the channel where we break down NZ Super, government support programs, and important updates that could affect your finances so you can make informed decisions and make sure you're receiving every entitlement you may qualify for. Let's start with the basics because getting this foundation right changes everything that follows. NZ Super is not automatically portable. The moment you leave New Zealand, different rules kick in depending on how long you're going for and which country you're going to. Get the timing or the paperwork wrong, and work and income can stop your payments, or ask you to pay some of it back. Get it right, and you can keep receiving your NZ Super, sometimes at the full rate, in dozens of countries around the world. There are 3 different pathways that determine what happens to your payment overseas. Understanding which one applies to you is the single most important thing you'll take away from this video. Stay with me because later I'll walk you through a real example with actual dollar figures so you can see exactly what this means for your own pocket. Let's deal with short trips first, because this is the situation most people find themselves in. If you're heading overseas for 26 weeks or less in any 12-month period and you're only receiving NZ Super or the Veterans Pension, you don't need to do anything. Your payment keeps landing in your bank account exactly as normal. No forms, no phone calls, no 6-week notice period. As long as you remain what Work and Income calls ordinarily resident in New Zealand, meaning New Zealand stays your normal home base, you're covered for up to 26 weeks away. But here's where people trip up. If you're also getting other support on top of your NZ Super, things like the winter energy payment, the accommodation supplement, or temporary additional support, you do need to tell Work and Income about your travel plans before you leave, no matter how long you're going for. Those extra payments generally stop the moment you leave New Zealand, or continue for a very limited window of around 28 days if you still meet the criteria while you're away. Miss this step, and you could come home to an unexpected debt. Now, here's something worth remembering if you're a planner. There's no minimum amount of time you have to spend back in New Zealand before you can head off again. As long as you genuinely remain ordinarily resident here, you can use your 26 weeks, come home, and use another 26 weeks later in the year. But if you're spending more time overseas than you are in New Zealand across a full year, that ordinarily resident test can come into question. If you're not sure where you stand, that's exactly the kind of thing worth a quick call to Work and Income before you book your flights. What happens if you're away and something goes wrong? A medical issue, a canceled flight, a family emergency, and you can't get home before the 26th week. This is a genuinely stressful situation for a lot of retirees, so listen carefully. If your delay is unexpected and beyond your control, you can apply to keep your payments going. You need to do this before the 26-week period finishes, not after. If you wait until you're already past the cutoff, you may miss out on payments you were otherwise entitled to. If the delay was your own choice, you simply decided to stay longer, the outcome is very different, and you may be required to pay back the payments you already received during that time. This is one of the most financially painful mistakes retirees make, and it's completely avoidable with a single phone call before the 26 weeks are up. Now let's talk about the bigger decision, actually moving overseas to live, not just travel. This is where the real planning needs to happen, and where I want you to pay close attention, because in a moment I'm going to walk you through the 3 different pathways your payment can take, and one of them might surprise you. If you're planning to be overseas for more than 26 weeks, whether that's a long working holiday, a family stay, or a full retirement move, you must apply to work and income to keep your NZ Super or Veterans Pension going. This is not automatic. You need to apply at least 6 weeks before you leave New Zealand. Miss that window, and you're taking a real risk with your income. To qualify to keep your payments going while overseas, you generally need to be receiving NZ Super in your own right, not as a partner included on someone else's payment, and you need to be ordinarily resident in New Zealand at the time you apply. Once you're approved, work and income will tell you exactly how much you'll receive because, and this is important, the amount is very often different from what you receive here in New Zealand. This brings us to the three pathways I mentioned. The first is what's called special portability, and it applies to 22 Pacific countries, including places like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. New Zealand has a special arrangement with these nations that allows retirees to continue receiving NZ Super if they intend to live there for more than 52 weeks. There's a critical detail here. You must apply to Work and Income's International Services team, and you must still be in New Zealand, ordinarily resident and already entitled to NZ Super before you leave. You cannot leave first and sort the paperwork out later. There's an even more specific arrangement for the Cook Islands, Niue, and Tokelau, New Zealand's realm countries. If you're heading to one of these three, you don't necessarily have to be in New Zealand to apply, and you may qualify for NZ Super or the Veterans Pension if you've lived in New Zealand for at least 10 years since turning 20. This is genuinely different from the rules for every other country, so if this applies to your situation, it's worth getting specific advice from international services rather than assuming the general rules apply to you. The second pathway is through what's called a Social Security Agreement, and New Zealand currently has these formal agreements with 11 countries: Australia, Canada, Denmark, Greece, Ireland, Jersey, Guernsey, Malta, the Netherlands, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. These agreements exist so retirees aren't unfairly penalized for splitting their working lives or their retirement between New Zealand and one of these partner countries. Australia deserves its own mention because it's by far the most common destination for retiring Kiwis, and it has its own distinct set of rules under the New Zealand-Australia Social Security Agreement. If you're planning a move across the Tasman, the process and the payment calculation work differently to a general Social Security Agreement move, so make sure you're looking specifically at the Australian guidance on the Work and Income website, and again, apply through international services at least 6 weeks before you go. Now here's the detail I flagged right at the start of this video, the one that catches almost everyone off guard. The United Kingdom is on that Social Security Agreement list. Naturally, most people assume that means their NZ Super simply continues if they move to the UK, the same way it might for Australia or Canada. It does not. Under the current rules, if you are living in the United Kingdom, you cannot receive NZ Super or the Veterans Pension. Instead, you may be able to access a UK benefit or pension under the separate UK Social Security Agreement arrangement. If you have family in the UK or you're planning a retirement move there, this is not a minor technicality. It's a completely different financial reality to the one most people assume. And it's exactly the kind of detail that needs to shape your planning well before you book a one-way ticket. The third pathway is what's called general portability. And this is the one that applies if you're moving to a country that isn't on the Pacific list and doesn't have a social security agreement with New Zealand. In this case, you can still receive your NZ Super, but the amount is calculated using a Pro-Rata formula based on how long you actually lived in New Zealand between the ages of 20 and 65. Let me walk you through exactly how this works because the maths matters here. Work and Income uses a total of 45 years or 540 months as the full benchmark. If you lived in New Zealand for the entire 45 years between 20 and 65, you can receive the full NZ Super rate overseas under this pathway. If you lived here for less than that, your payment is scaled down proportionally. Here's a practical example using the calculation method Work and Income itself publishes. Say you lived in New Zealand for 18 years between the ages of 20 and 65, That's 216 months. Work and income divides your 216 months by the full 540 months and multiplies that fraction by the NZ Super rate. For a single person, that works out to roughly 40% of the full rate. For a couple, the same formula applies to the couple rate. The exact dollar figure will depend on the current NZ Super rate at the time, which is reviewed every 1st of April, so always confirm your specific figure directly with work and income before you make a final decision to move. There's one detail about general portability that trips a lot of people up, and it actually works in your favor. If you're moving to one of these non-agreement countries and you also receive a pension from that country, or from anywhere else overseas, it generally will not reduce your prorated NZ super payment under this general pathway. That's different to how overseas pensions can interact with your payment while you're still living in New Zealand, where a direct deduction can apply. If you're weighing up a country with no agreement against a country with an agreement, this is exactly the kind of detail worth discussing directly with international services, because it can materially change your total retirement income. Now, a word on years spent overseas earlier in your life, because this affects how many months actually count toward that 45-year benchmark. If you spent time overseas between 20 and 65, say for work or family reasons, that time generally doesn't count as time lived in New Zealand, with a small number of exceptions such as government service. Work and income defines lived in New Zealand quite specifically. You need to have been both resident and physically present here at the same time. If you've had a complex history moving in and out of the country, it's worth getting your residency history documented and verified well before you apply, because gathering that paperwork after the fact from overseas is far harder than doing it now. Let's talk about something that catches a lot of couples off guard because it's an emotional issue as much as a financial one. If you have a partner included in your NZ Super or Veterans Pension payment because they don't separately qualify, their payment stops the moment you leave New Zealand to live overseas. They simply don't meet the criteria to be included once you're no longer both ordinarily resident here. There is an exception if you're going overseas to do humanitarian work, and there's flexibility if you're heading to a Social Security agreement country, where your partner may be able to apply for a payment in that country instead. But if you come back to New Zealand later, you cannot simply re-include your partner in your payment again. They'll need to apply for NZ Super or the Veterans Pension themselves once they personally qualify. This is a detail that deserves a proper conversation with your partner and with work and income well before you finalize any overseas move, not after you've already landed. Once you're set up and receiving payments overseas, there are ongoing obligations you need to stay on top of. Work and income will periodically send you what's called a client declaration form, usually every 6 or 12 months, depending on your circumstances. This confirms you're still alive, still eligible, and your circumstances haven't changed. Ignore one of these forms, and your payments can be suspended. You're also required to notify work and income of any changes. A new address, a change in your relationship status, or if you start receiving a new overseas pension. These aren't optional formalities. They're how work and income make sure your payment stays correct and how you avoid being asked to repay money later because your file wasn't up to date. Now let's clear up some genuine confusion around the residency rules because there's a lot of noise out there right now, and I want to make sure you're working from accurate information, not headlines designed to grab your attention. You may have seen claims online suggesting the residency requirement for NZ Super is suddenly jumping from 10 years to 20 years. That framing is misleading. What's actually happening is a long, gradual, birth date-based phase-in that started back on the 1st of July 2024. The number of years you personally need depends entirely on your date of birth, and it increases in small steps roughly every 2 years. If you were born on or before the 30th of June 1959, you still only need 10 years. If you were born after the 1st of July 1977, you'll eventually need the full 20 years. But that requirement doesn't fully apply until 2042. In every case, you still need at least 5 of those years to have been lived in New Zealand after you turned 50. If you're already receiving NZ Super, none of this affects you at all. And if you're approaching 65 in the next few years, it's very likely you're still sitting well under that 20-year figure. The safest thing you can do is check your own date of birth against the official work and income table, rather than relying on a headline that doesn't apply the actual phase-in schedule correctly. You may also have come across claims that your NZ Super simply travels with you at full value no matter where in the world you retire. As I've walked you through today, that's not accurate either. Full rate portability is really only available through the Pacific Special Portability Arrangement and the Social Security Agreement countries, and even then, only if you follow the correct application process and timing. Everywhere else, you're working with that pro-rata calculation based on your years lived in New Zealand. So let's bring this together into what actually matters for your situation. If you're planning a short trip of 26 weeks or less and you only receive NZ Super, you genuinely don't need to do anything. Just make sure you remain ordinarily resident in New Zealand. If you're receiving any other supplementary payments, notify work and income before you leave. If you're planning to be away for longer than 26 weeks, whether that's an extended stay or a full move, apply at least 6 weeks before you leave, and take the time to work out which of the three pathways applies to you. Pacific Special Portability, a Social Security Agreement country, or General Portability. If you're weighing up the United Kingdom specifically, go in with your eyes open about the fact that NZ Super isn't payable while you're living there, and look into what UK-based support you might be entitled to instead. If you have a partner included in your payment, have an honest conversation about what happens to their income the moment you leave the country. And once you're overseas, stay on top of your client declaration forms and keep work and income updated on any change in your circumstances, so a simple paperwork gap doesn't turn into a repayment notice. Take a moment to consider whether any of this applies to your own retirement plans. If you've got family overseas, if you're weighing up a move to Australia, the Pacific, or further afield, or if you're simply approaching 65 and want to understand your options properly, the smartest first step is a direct conversation with Work and Income's International Services team. They can confirm your exact residency years, your exact pathway, and your exact payment amount based on your personal circumstances. Because every one of these figures depends on your own history, and getting confirmation directly from Work and Income is the only way to know exactly where you stand. To sum up what we've covered today, your NZ Super can follow you overseas, but how much you receive and whether you receive anything at all depends entirely on how long you're going for and which country you're heading to. Short trips under 26 weeks are generally simple. Longer stays and permanent moves require an application at least 6 weeks in advance and fall into one of three very different pathways. The United Kingdom is the trap that catches people who assume a Social Security agreement automatically means their payment continues. And the residency requirement changes are gradual and birth date specific, not the sudden overnight shift some headlines suggest. Make sure you're not missing out on support you may be entitled to, and make sure you're not caught out by a rule you didn't know applied to you. If you found this update helpful, make sure you subscribe to New Zealand Pension Plan. I'm David, and my goal is to help you stay informed about NZ Super, WINZ, MSD, and every important government support update that could affect your finances. Thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next update.